Hi, everybody. Give me just 1 second to get the presentation started. There we go. And oops. And then we should be good to go. Well, thank you all for joining us via webinar today. My name is Regina. I am the Genealogy Librarian here at the State Library. I also used to work over at the New Jersey State Archives. So New Jersey documents, records, and history are really passions of mine. If you know me or if you've attended my classes before, you know that I spend a lot of time doing more instructional classes, how to do genealogy. But there are some really cool stories and narratives that come up when we're doing genealogy services that kind of help to humanize individuals throughout histories, especially those who lived a really long time ago. My passion over time has become 17th and early 18th century research because of my interest in my 300-year-old dead boyfriend, Jeremiah Bass, who we'll be discussing a little bit later in the presentation. And I think that presentations like this kind of put a human face on people who have been dead for so long rather than them just being, you know, a line on a page in a written story. So this is more of an entertainment genealogy class, and hopefully it will help you to kind of build narratives in your own research that help to tell individual stories. The presentation will probably be a little bit shorter than my normal presentations. I'm aiming for about 45 minutes. It might be a little bit less. And before we get started, I just wanted to warn you that all three of the stories that I will be telling you today don't really have satisfactory conclusions because the records kind of stop at a certain point. But I really hope that this sparks your interest in looking in particular at court records as great sources of genealogy resources, as a lot of parts of these stories are told through court records. So without further ado, let's dive in. If you hear pages rustling, it's because I had to transcribe some notes on some things and I may be shifting around and reading things. So I apologize in advance, but that said, let us dive in. Oops, come on, you can do it. And let me go back. Whoops. Sorry. Okay, there we are. So our first story that we are going to tell is that of Patience Rutter. Before I talk about Patience, let me tell you a little bit about how I discovered her. On the left side of the screens, you'll see an image of some boxes. These are the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas records. When I worked over at the archives, the first time I worked there twice, once for 4 years, once for 2 years. And one of my projects that was assigned to me the first time I worked there was going through and organizing the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas documents. These needed to be organized because they were sorted. So the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas met quarterly. So it met 4 times a year, and presumably judges within the county rode all around Middlesex County on a circuit. The papers for hundreds of years were organized within the quarter session. So there could be a cohesive case that proceeded throughout months or years, but depending on when the case was heard in what various quarters, part of the case was stored in various quarters rather than all the paperwork relevant to a single case being stored together. So my job was to organize this stuff, all of the paperwork associated with the case, into a cohesive case files, taking it out of the quarter session and making and putting all paperwork relevant to a single case into a specific folder. Patience Rutter's case was one of the documents that was found within these quarter sessions. I believe hers happened in the late 1750s, in 1757. You can see a clear copy of her certificate of indenture. She became an indentured servant. We're not talking about certificate of indenture in terms of a land record or a deed. You'll see that frequently in deed records. It's called this indenture. But this is an actual contract for an indentured servitude of a woman named Patience Rutter. I apparently sorted this into its own case file. Unfortunately, there were only 2 or 3 documents associated with this case. But when I left the archives for the first time, the middle image, as one of my going away presents, I was given a high resolution scan of this particular document because it was so interesting and so rich and detailed about this woman's life. And I still have it to this day. It's in the frame, like you see in the middle picture, in a place of honor on top of my bookcase. It's one of my treasured possessions because I look back with great fondness on this particular collection, the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas papers, because it really sparked my interest in 18th century research. So that said, let's talk about who Patience Rutter was and what happened to her and why her story is so interesting. This case is a really great example of how we can learn a great deal about an individual just from court documents. So the original certificate of indenture for Patience Rutter was signed in February of 1757. At the time, Patience was 18 years old. She became extremely ill, and a man named Josiah Wynans, who was a hatter, paid for her doctor's bill and medical care in exchange for her indentured servitude for a period of 14 years. Interestingly, Patience in this document is described as an Indian squaw, so she was of Native American origin. So we learn a whole lot about her circumstances. This all comes from her certificate of indenture, which again is in the middle picture and the left picture. From this, you'll see at the bottom right of the documents, the probability is that she could not write because she signed with the mark. If she could write, she may have still been ill and could not physically hold a pen to sign her name when this document was presented to her. This is the reverse page of the certificate of indenture that we just looked at. You can see that there is a note of some kind on the back of this this document. However, you'll see that only the middle portion of the document is really clearly written. A lot of it is very, very faded and you can just barely see it. It looks like bleed through from the opposite side of the page, but it's not. I have done my best to transcribe this letter for you. A lot of time was spent hunched over this document with a magnifying glass trying to figure out what the faded letter said, and I couldn't figure out all of it. So it doesn't 100% make sense and my transcription doesn't, but I'm going to read to you what I was able to piece together, and then we'll discuss further. So this is what the letter says to the best of my ability to transcribe it. Dear gentlemen, this the humble petition of a poor unfortunate person that humbly begs your assistance for to stand friend, for she being in a very great trouble and distress, the cause of story is thus, being at a person's house very ill about 7 weeks, he employed a doctor for me, for which he charges 21 pounds, the doctor bill being 5. He sold me for 14 years and I served 10 years, and now he wants to sell me for 4 years longer. I humbly beg you will take it into consideration which time I had, and he to me to serve 3 years, for which if I do, I will serve 7 years longer. I beg you will take into consideration and stand friend for that no one, for which I will pay for it in person, in which he has not found me clothes sufficient, nor no, and it trails off from there. I couldn't read the last 4 words. So how I interpret this is that Patience is afraid that her original indenture contract for 14 years, which she's currently served 10, she's going to be, her indenture contract for 14 years is going to be violated, or it's already been violated. Mr. Wynans, who she sold her services to, wants to extend her terms of service, and in addition, hasn't fulfilled his responsibilities, which are laid out in the certificate of indenture, which does explicitly state he is to provide board, clothing, and food for her. And she's alleging in her letter that he has not done that. Plus, for the length of time he wants to sell her services to somebody else, it will extend her indenture for 4 years beyond, because the terms that he wants to sell her for will add up to an additional 7 years plus the 14. So just from this single document, we learn a whole lot. And to me, it's quite remarkable that the court took this woman, this indentured servant who was not white, seriously enough to try this case in court. Also included in this case file for Patience Rutter is a letter from Josiah Wynans. This one is much clearer and easier to read. And it says this. What is interesting is that Mr. Wynans sold Patience early in her contract to someone named Mr. Moore in exchange for a horse valued at about 18 pounds, 10 shillings. He remembers how much the horse is valued down to the shilling, but he can't remember exactly when he sold Patience or how long exactly she'd been with her new master. And this is what his letter says. Madam, the Indian girl I sold to Moore about 10 years ago for a horse worth about 18 pounds and about 10 shillings in money. But as for the exact time Moore has had her, I cannot tell, but I believe near that time. From your friend Josiah Wynans. And this is January 1767. So if Patience signed her indenture contract in February of 1757, this is January 1767, so it's been about 10 years. this is all we have on Patience Rutter, although there's a massive wealth of information in this document. We don't know whether or not she is successful in getting the court to help her. And this is because over at the archives, they have the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas minute books on microfilm. However, guess which roll of microfilm is missing? The 1767 Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas minute books roll of microfilm is not at the archives. Rutgers owns the original, and I have not had a chance to travel up to Rutgers to look at it. And maybe if I do in a future version of this presentation, I will be able to give you a little bit more information on Patience. That said, even though this really doesn't have a satisfying conclusion, other than that a Native American woman in a position of subjugation was able to successfully convince the court to hear her case. And like I said before, this is an amazing case file. It has so much individual information about this woman, Patience, and also a lot of information about Josiah Wynans. If you were interested in researching his family history, you would get a lot of background information on him. So this, I think, is a really fascinating story. And like I said, Patience Rutter's certificate of indenture, I still have the high quality scanned, and it's a prized possession. And it really, I feel, shows how important and essential these court documents are to genealogical research. So let us continue. Whereas Patience has a wealth of information in her file, the next lady, whose name is Susannah, really does not. And hers is a fascinating story that I would love to learn more about. Oops. There we go. So in this particular case file, we only have a single document, which is a writ delivered by the sheriff of Middlesex County to a William Bloodgood, who, it's alleged, attempted to claim a free Black woman named Susannah as a slave. Susannah, this individual woman, this individual free woman, is suing William Bloodgood for replevin, meaning she is suing him for the cost of stolen property. And in this case, the stolen property is herself. A great example of the replevin cases that runs through these Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas is that of a man whose name is Moses Burgess. He had a flock, well, I should not say flock because they are not birds, although sometimes pigs do fly, at least allegedly. A herd of swine that escaped from his property. He sued several of his neighbors to recover the cost of these swines in replevin cases. And these cases lasted over a period of 12 years, probably long after the said hogs or swine were long gone and had disappeared. Probably because Moses Burgess was so prolific in the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas document, I will end up doing a separate story about him. But he's just a really great example of how a replevin case works and how it can drag on and on and on and involve many, many people. Unfortunately, this one, in which we would love to have more information, because this is just a fascinating story tidbit, we really don't get too much more than this. In case you are wondering about this writ itself, it is very boilerplate language. I have not even attempted to transcribe it because there is nothing of interest to say. These little writs would be delivered to the party who is being sued, and they basically say, on this date, you need to report to the Court of Common Pleas to answer charges of the person who's accusing them, what they're accused of, and that's it. And it gives you who the Chief Justice is, who the clerk is, and who the attorney for the plaintiff is. So Susannah, in this case, has her own attorney, which is also very interesting. This case took place in 1761, so this is still pre-Revolutionary War. Although I'm sure ideas of the abolition movement have been trickling in and become more and more acceptable throughout the 18th century, I feel like this is still fairly early on, particularly in Middlesex County, which was heavily Dutch. The Dutch relied greatly on slavery, which makes this, to me, pretty extraordinary for Middlesex County. Like I said, though, although this is a fascinating scenario, because this writ is so boilerplate, there's really not all that much to tell. All we are told is that this man attempted to enslave this woman, who we know is free, and that this woman, Susannah, is a person of color, and that William Bloodgood attempted to enslave her. So where do we go from here? How do we find more information? Well, I tried to, because, as I did mention, the Middlesex County Court of Common Pleas minute books are owned by Rutgers, but the State Archives does have them available on microfilm. Unlike the 1767 minute book, they did have the 1761 minute book. And the court minute books will give you entries about, you know, kind of what happened during a particular quarter session, what motions were filed, things of that nature. And they will sometimes give you an outcome of a case. And that is what I was really hoping to find. However, in this case, although we are very lucky that it was recorded, because some cases, even though we have the case files, are not recorded in the minute books. In this case, we get a brief record of this case. We know that Susannah, a free Negro, is suing William Bloodgood. I posted the full page where Susannah's entry appears, and then I've blown up on the left the little case. And unfortunately, I combed through the minute books for the rest of the quarter sessions. You can see that this case was recorded in the July quarter session in 1761. There are no further entries, so we do not know the outcome at all. Is this because the lawsuit never moved forward? We don't know. Did someone just forget to record things? Possibly, but we don't know. Unfortunately, as with many colonial era case records, we have some really extraordinary basic information, but nothing to flesh it out. So I don't know where Susannah's story goes from here or how it ended. But again, like Patience Rutter, who is also a woman of color, it's pretty extraordinary that a woman and a woman of color in Middlesex County, which I said was conservative Dutch, was able to take presumably a white man who was attempting to enslave her to court. And the court took it seriously enough to at least hear her case. So that is Susannah's story. Again, I'm not sure where this one would pick up, since we do not even know if she had a last name or where else to find her. I've checked the newspaper extracts, which is another really great resource, and that was no help. So unfortunately, without a last name or any more information about this lady to go on, unfortunately, I think this is all we have. Now, our last case is going to be about a much more wealthy woman. And this is also going to delve into other record groups other than court cases, although a court case does play a prominent role in this story as well. This woman was white, and she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the colony of New Jersey at the time. It's very interesting, but again, after everything is resolved, all of the documents are filed, she sort of disappears from history. So let us talk about Dorothy Hickman. Although first we have to talk about Jeremiah Bass, who is my 300-year-old dead boyfriend. Yes, I'm such a creepy stalker that I have a research binder on him. That is my Bass research binder. By the way, the image is not actually of Bass. No contemporary portraits of him survive. If you've taken my Bass class, I do have a whole separate class all about Jeremiah Bass because I am obsessed. You know that I use a cheesy 80s romance novel with Fabio posing on the cover as my placeholder for Bass because no portraits of him actually exist. It would probably infuriate him to know that contemporary images of 3 of his rivals do continue to exist. Those are William Penn, who he hated and who hated him, the Earl of Belmont, who was the governor of New York at the same time as him, and Governor Andrew Hamilton, who was governor both before and after Jeremiah Bass was. How I found Dorothy Hickman is through Jeremiah Bass, which is why we're going to talk about him for a minute. Bass was not a Quaker, and he lived in West Jersey. This is highly significant because West New Jersey in the late, well, throughout the 17th and 18th century was a Quaker stronghold. And because it was a Quaker stronghold, Quakers had a lot of secular political power. Mr. Bass was Church of England, what we know here in the United States currently as Anglican. And he really resented Quaker power and influence. He and others like him who were working to unseat Quakers politically worked to establish a really strong Church of England congregation in Burlington City, New Jersey. Their church was founded in the late 17th century. Their congregation was founded in the late 17th century. However, their church was actually built, the physical building and the congregation was actually built in 1702. The name of this church originally was St. Anne's, and it changed to St. Mary's. This is still an active congregation in Burlington. The church, the original early 18th century church, is still in Burlington City. You can still see it. They also have a newer building, which is really interesting. I started researching congregants of St. Mary's Church who are contemporary to Jeremiah Bass because I was interested in learning more about him. and learning more about this political struggle between Church of England and Quakers in West New Jersey, because I find it absolutely fascinating. And it's given me tons of background information on Bass. So all of these very powerful, very wealthy Anglicans or Church of England devotees who were in Burlington were members of this St. Mary's Church. One of Bass's fellow congregants was named Jon Haytham. And that is of note. Jon Haytham is described, he was probably the wealthiest man in New Jersey at the time. He came over in the late 17th century. He built massive houses in both Bensalem, Pennsylvania, which is right across the river from us in Bucks County, and also in Burlington. And both of these houses are described as palaces. Palaces, not big houses, not any other descriptors, palaces. After Jon Haytham's death, in a massive political move, the Church of England congregants in Burlington wanted a bishopric established in Burlington, New Jersey. They successfully got their bishop, John Talbot, their head minister, John Talbot, elected as a bishop, but the bishopric was never formally established at St. Mary's. And after Jon Haytham's death, the congregation purchased his palace in Burlington, and they were going to use it as the bishop's residence. But that never came to fruition. The other significant thing about St. Mary's Church is that many of these families were looking to intermarry. They were looking for political alliances within the Church of England community. And that will be significant to Dorothy's story. The other relevant bit of information here is at the time of Dorothy's story, which is around 1700, is that piracy was a massive, massive problem in New Jersey, and indeed in any of the mainland colonies or Caribbean British colonies at this time. And I'm sure not all of the pirates looked like Johnny Depp, although in this case, in Dorothy's story, you can picture them that way, or as Fabio with an eye patch, whatever you want. But this was a huge problem, and when Jeremiah Bass was governor, this was a major, major responsibility for him to try to cut down on piracy. The world was a lot bigger of a place, and rather than having just a few major ports, there were several smaller ports in New Jersey. In New Jersey, Burlington City, Perth Amboy, Newark, and Elizabeth were all very important ports, and all had a major piracy problem. Bass, when he was governor, was highly praised for cracking down on piracy in New Jersey. And Bass several times wrote to the Royal Council to try to get them to take more stringent action or give him more power in order to deal with pirates and piracy. Bass's rival, Andrew Hamilton, had a very similar problem when he was governor, both before and after Bass as well. So, again, Jeremiah Bass, and why we were talking about him and why I'm building this context is to better tell Dorothy Hickman's story. So, Jon Haytham, who we talked about, he of the two palaces, he who was probably one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest man in New Jersey, died very suddenly in 1700. And this is how I found his daughter. This was actually a mail reference request over at the state archives, and our standard operating procedure over there was, when we were dealing with handwritten wills, to look in the published calendar of New Jersey wills, which contain little abstracts, and print them out for the person ordering the record, so that way if they can't read the handwriting, they'll still be able to pull all of the relevant bits from this. You can see that Jon Haytham died in July on the left, and his wife Elizabeth died in October of that same year. So they both died suddenly, but very close together. I believe the request in particular where I found Dorothy was the request from Jon Haytham's will, because you can see in particular in this little abstract, it mentions his daughter, Dorothy Hickman. And she's disowned for her, quote, graceless and shameless rebellion, and she gets a piece of 8, and that is it. You can see that on the right in Elizabeth Haytham's will, where's Dorothy in here? Daughter Dorothy Hickman's receives only 6 shillings if lawfully demanded. And so Elizabeth Haytham also disowned her daughter. And so when I saw that Jon Haytham had specifically said that his daughter performed a graceless and shameless rebellion, and she had a different last name than him, I guess that she had probably married somebody that Daddy didn't approve of. Remember, this is hugely significant because at this time, the Church of England congregants at St. Mary's are looking to consolidate political power. So I'm sure Daddy wanted Dorothy, his eldest daughter, to make a strategic political marriage that would benefit him and also his cohort. Now, in good news, Elizabeth, it's very interesting. Elizabeth was pregnant at the time of her husband's death, and she gave birth. She died either giving birth or shortly after giving birth. It's unknown whether or not her child survived, but she had a deathbed recantation of her will, and verbally told her midwives and other women who were present at her birth that she wanted her daughter Dorothy to receive 200 pounds. So that's interesting. That's chump change compared to what her other children received. However, 200 pounds is still a significant amount of money for back then, and it tells you how wealthy and powerful the Haythams were. Jon Haytham was still alive when his daughter got married. And at the time, because Jeremiah Bass, Church of England, was governor, and he was a congregant at St. Mary's, Jon Haytham was appointed as one of the justices on the Burlington County Court of Common Pleas. He found out that his daughter was married in a tavern. She married his daughter Dorothy, who in this court case, I believe is described as his eldest daughter. This is, again, is the Burlington County Court of Common Pleas, which works similarly to Middlesex, where they met quarterly. The judges rode on a circuit, and paperwork was filed quarterly. So in this court case, we learn what specifically Dorothy did to get disowned. She married a Robert Hickman, who was a suspected pirate. At a Quaker tavern owner's house, this woman was named Elizabeth Bassnett. And then, of course, there's this hatred of Quakers going on. So Jon Haytham, being a justice of the Court of Common Pleas, cracked down on this this tavern owner, Elizabeth Bassnett, who was both a Quaker, and allowed his daughter to be married in her tavern, which was operated out of her home. He has Elizabeth Bassnett's tavern license revoked, presumably since she was a widow. This was her source of income, so I'm sure this was a massive blow to her ability to earn money. The Burlington County Court of Common Pleas court book has been transcribed and published. So I've placed a copy of the entry on the upper left. The original, an image of the original Court of Common Pleas minute book entry is on the right. This particular case is that tiny bottom paragraph, that very tiny bottom paragraph. And I attempted to enlarge it, but as you can see, it's incredibly blurry. So it's much easier just to read the printed story. So I learned a little bit more about Robert Hickman, who Dorothy Tatum married. This comes from a book called Pirate's Nest and the Rise of the British Empire. Apparently, after Dorothy's marriage, her husband was arrested in 1700. They were married in winter 1700. He was arrested in 1700. And I should state that actually, technically, this was probably 1699 to 1700. They were going by the old calendar. So the new year back then did not start until March 25th was the beginning of the new year. So Dorothy was married in 1699/1700 in the winter. Her father died in July of 1700. She married a man named Robert Hickman, who came to New Jersey from Madagascar. He married her in February 1700. The Quaker community rallied around the couple, probably because they didn't like Jon Haytham or Jeremiah Bass very much. They resented the Anglicans' attempt to seize power. So we know that he was arrested. We know that Robert was taken back to England to be tried for piracy. We know that he was convicted of piracy, but then given clemency. In William Penn's papers, William Penn has some more information on Robert Hickman. He interceded on Hickman's behalf. William Penn probably helped to get him pardoned. He was arrested, and he did pay bail along with one other pirate once he arrived in England. So he was out on bail up until his trial. His bail was 200 pounds, which is interesting because it's the amount that Dorothy inherited from her mother, who had died in October of 1700. So it's possible that they used Dorothy's inheritance to pay his bail and get him out of jail, although we don't know. Let's see, is there anything else good in here? No, there's not really anything else. So Dorothy, has a very nice outcome, we assume. Her husband is not executed for piracy. She may have sailed to England to be with him. We know from Dorothy's mother, Elizabeth Tatham's inventory, that she had her own place of residence in Burlington because things were inventoried belonging to her mother that were described as being at Dorothy Hickman. So it's possible she could have either gone to England with her husband or she could have stayed in Burlington. Unfortunately, after Robert is freed of piracy, you can find his piracy trial where he's found guilty online. I didn't post that as part of these slides because they don't mention Dorothy at all. But she also could have stayed back in Burlington, and unfortunately, this couple disappears from history after that. So we only know what we know. The last place that Dorothy is mentioned is in the trial or the Burlington County Court of Common Pleas case against Elizabeth Bassnett. And then Robert is further mentioned in his piracy case, but the outcome for Dorothy is unfortunately not known. However, I have recently been doing some research. I was debating on whether or not to tell you this. I was looking through St. Mary's, one of their early transcribed record books, and I found a Robert Hickman paying dues to St. Mary's Church in 1702 and 1703. There was another Hickman family in Burlington who seems to be separate from Robert Hickman, so it could have been those Hickmans. But it's also possible that after he was acquitted, Robert did come back to Burlington and they settled there. But again, I can't find any trace of them, anything even remotely close after this case file. If you are interested in learning more about Jon Haytham, his story is like a soap opera. This article by Henry Bisbee is a really excellent article. I am going to post a blog with some of the citations that I've discussed in this book. Jon Haytham, who disowned his daughter for marrying a pirate, and who was so morally outraged, was allegedly a secret Catholic and former priest who swindled his congregation out of money, which he used to establish himself in New Jersey and build a massive fortune. Apparently, William Penn knew about him and kept an eye on him, but he allowed him to flee England. At the time, James II was about to be deposed and replaced by, and James II was Catholic sympathetic at the very least. He may have been outright Catholic, I can't remember. However, he was hugely unpopular, and his daughter and her husband were going to come in. This was William and Mary as rulers. They were definitely pro-Protestant. There was talk that all English Catholics, there was going to be a major purge of English Catholics. So that's probably why Jon Haytham fled and stole money from his congregation. Jon Haytham again became very powerful over here in New Jersey. And after he fled, his congregation, who he stole from, did attempt to get him extradited back to England to stand trial for the theft. But he had so many character witnesses testifying to his good, moral, upright character and all that jazz, that he was able to stay free and was never arrested. Jon Haytham may have secretly been a Catholic, which is very interesting. He had tons of Catholic books and items in his inventory. Apparently, he sued somebody for libel who called him a filthy papist, which is 18th century slang for Catholic. So it's unknown whether or not he had a change of faith and how that affected his family, including his daughter, Dorothy. But that is Dorothy's story, and I hope you've enjoyed learning more about how you can kind of build a narrative around, individuals in your genealogy stories. But that's all I have. And if you have any questions, please do let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. If anybody has any questions, again, please send them in the chat, or there is also the question part of your menu. You can also submit them there. So we'll wait a few minutes and see if anybody has any questions.
Yep, and again, I'll be posting a blog with citations where you can find the documents related to these three women. So you can look out for that and gain some more information there.
All right, it appears nobody has any questions. So again, thank you everybody for attending today. We are hoping to convert some of our programming into webinars, so please check our events calendar for any upcoming digital programming. So thank you and have a great day.